Today, many Americans have lost faith in some of our key institutions.
Trust in our institutions, trust in each other is at an all-time low.
From the news media,
Americans' trust in the news media has been declining in recent years,
to the Supreme Court.
Our trust in the Supreme Court has never been lower.
And are political divisions driving this lack of confidence?
How can we even talk to each other with so much space dividing us? Right now, 44% of Democrats and 45% of Republicans have a very unfavorable opinion of the other party and its members.
It's pretty clear the era of bipartisanship is over.
If Americans can broadly agree on nothing else, we should be able to agree that much of the bitterness and political tribalism that drives our public discussions is unhealthy for our country. In order to debate contentious public policy issues in a respectful and engaging manner without abandoning deeply held principles, the Cato Institute, in collaboration with the Brookings Institution, presents Sphere. In this episode, how do we restore faith in our institutions? Political division and strife have been something of a defining characteristic of this past year, leading to a distrust and a lack of faith in some of our most important key functions of government. Do we trust our elections, our judicial system, our federal agencies, or our elected officials? And if trust is waning, how can we restore some faith in those institutions? Joining me to discuss are Peter Goettler, President and CEO of the Cato Institute, Elaine Kamarck, Senior Fellow in Governance Studies at the Brookings Institution, and Jeffrey Rosen, President and CEO of the National Constitution Center. Welcome to Sphere. Let's start with how we got here. Peter, you've said it that both political parties are willing to take down institutions for short-term political gain. What do you mean by that?
Just seems to me, Allan, that we're in an environment where the end seems to always justify the means. And so I think we can put blame on both political parties for doing things that are contravene the rule of law, not in fidelity with the Constitution, and sacrifice their institutions in order to achieve short-term policy victories. I had a friend who was in 2020 contemplating voting for Joe Biden. And he told me that he felt that he'd be more comfortable with the policy that he'd see out of the Trump administration, but was voting for Biden because he felt that there was risk to a continued Trump presidency, risk to institutions, risk to norms, et cetera. And it was interesting because he said that he was grappling with this and really became convinced that, how to cast his vote. Because someone said to him, hey, on policy stuff, like the tide goes in and the tide goes out on that stuff. But fidelity to the Constitution, protection of institutions, defending the rule of law, those are the things that, really matter long term.
Elaine, I wanted to pose the same question to you. It seems to be, given some of our conversations, that both parties, especially and perhaps increasingly over recent years, are comfortable putting aside institutions, norms, whatever it might happen to be, for the sake of winning in the short term. Does that match your point of view here? What seems to be driving that in your perspective?
What seems to be driving this is a distorted picture of what the public sphere is. And I'm sensitive to this because the Trump administration is beginning their look at cutting government. And they're talking about the government as if it's one big blob filled with people who push paper. And when you start breaking down what we have to do together, what we have to do for a society to function, okay, it gets a lot less controversial. So, air traffic control, okay? You kind of need people kind of need those 1,800 people landing airplanes and making sure they don't run into each other. You could do it privately. Okay, so European countries do it privately. We happen to do it through a public agency. What's controversial about that? Absolutely nothing. There's also nothing controversial about border patrol. Even Democrats, even Bernie Sanders says we can't have open borders. We need border patrol. So when you start looking at what's in this government that they seem to fight about so much, it's a lot less controversial than the argument about it. And the argument seems a little bit detached from reality. And I don't know exactly how to fix this, other than this is one of those results of many, many years of bad schools and high schools teaching nonsense instead of basic stuff like civics and math and literature. I don't know how to fix this. This is a country that has a conversation about the public sector that is unrelated to the needs of the country, and which, if in fact implemented, everybody would be mad about.
So, Jeffrey, I want to come to you next, in part because your role at the National Constitution Center as a strictly nonpartisan organization puts you in a position to be able to look out broadly and say, what are the trends we're seeing? But also, your role as a historian, as an individual who's looked at how we've gotten to where we are, gives you a keen eye into how things have developed. As you take a look out there, what do you see both historically and contemporarily that paints this picture of the kind of decreasing faith in institutions?
The question of whether or not to trust government was a founding era debate that goes back to Hamilton and Jefferson. I've just finished up a new book on the Hamilton-Jefferson debate, and they disagreed about whether or not government deserved trust. Hamilton thought citizens had a duty to entrust confidence in government and to only vote at elections, but otherwise to express trust. Jefferson thinks there's an unalterable conflict between liberty and power. He's the great libertarian and thinks that mistrust of government is healthy. However, and here's the crucial thing that we're facing today, Jefferson has incredible faith in public reason, and he thinks that if given enough information about public affairs through the public papers, as he calls it, then truth will combat error in a fair fight. What's different now is that we're losing faith in public reason, and the explosion of conspiracy theories, of the fact that citizens don't trust neutral experts, and that they're not willing to deliberate and converge on a common agreement about truth itself is really an existential threat to the entire Enlightenment project and to the American idea, to the degree that we are rested on the ideas of liberty, equality, and self-government, all rooted in public reason. Very complicated factors that have created this moment, including obviously new media technologies that ensure that misinformation and conspiracy theories can travel further and faster than those based on the kind of complicated arguments that the founders thought were necessary for citizens to govern themselves. But unless, it all goes back to civic education, unless citizens take the time to read the primary sources, to educate themselves, to learn about history so they can live up to its ideals and avoid its errors, then the founders' faith in reason will not be fulfilled.
I do love that all the panelists so far, you're all strongly in favor of civic education. So just wanted a quick shout out to all of our social studies teachers out there.
Yes.
Elaine,
You didn't even have to ask us to do that.
Yeah, that's right.
I slipped some money under the table earlier. Elaine, Jeff, you both mentioned, I think, a point that's a really interesting one that I want to build in, and that is thinking about the role that information plays in shaping some of what we're seeing today. One of the key pieces of conversation that have been happening in broader public discourse is, are elements like disinformation and misinformation contributing to that kind of destruction in the faith of government? That is there a problem where there is bad information out there that's leading to distrust in a whole variety of different places? Elaine, I want to come to you first because I know this is a point that you've been wrestling with a lot lately.
Yeah.
As you've been thinking about it, what role does things like misinformation, disinformation play in the kind of consequences we're seeing, and what can be done about it?
It plays a huge role, okay? It plays a huge role, and we can't combat it easily anymore. It moves too quickly. You know, the government, there's been a loss of faith in experts. So when experts say, no, that's not true, people say, oh, you're an expert. I'm not going to believe you. You know, we've gone down a really dangerous rabbit hole here. And you see it in people's attitudes towards government all over the place. And yet, when the government is needed, when there is an emergency, what do people say? Where's the government? That's what they say. That's what they want there. They want those FEMA checks coming out. They want the trucks there. They want the trucks delivering water, etc. You know, when you explain to people that, okay, there's this bureaucracy in Washington, and what on earth do all these people do? They think they can get rid of them. Well, no. They let the contracts to have the trucks in place on a moment's notice so that when there are catastrophes, they can actually get trucks with fresh water to people who are in dire straits. All of that requires an enormous amount of back-end organization. And so the sort of lack of appreciation for the complexity of the world and the things that people take for granted is really astonishing in this day and age. And then it all comes back to somehow there's something terrible in Washington and you have to drain the swamp and get rid of all these people. Well, all these people, it turns out, or many of them, I wouldn't say all of them, are doing things that actually citizens want them to do. Mm-hmm. So let me give you a perfect example. There's about 60,000 people working in the Social Security Administration. They oversee $1.5 trillion in benefits every year to your grandmother, okay, or your parents. Now, when people turn 65 or 67 and they need to get on Social Security, one of those people is responsible for making sure they get on. So, look, I'm a person who cut almost 500,000 people out of the federal government. But we did it by using a scalpel, not an axe, right? We looked at processes, we looked at information technology, we looked for savings, etc. And it can be done. But this sort of notion that you can lop off entire things, it's crazy, and it goes back to people not knowing anything about what their government does, and therefore they lose trust in it.
Peter, let me pull you in at this point, because I know when it comes to the conversation about faith in government and whether or not people are excited about what government does, you have some different perspectives than Elaine there.
Sure.
Tell us a little bit about what you're thinking.
Yeah, I think some of the items that Elaine has cited are things that probably wouldn't be controversial among many members of the public, like air traffic control or FEMA. But I do think there are a lot of things that the government does that it either shouldn't be doing or would be better left to lower levels of government, state government, municipal government. I think that I'd be interested in Jeff's perspective on this, because I think that one of the reasons that we've gotten to where we are and that has accelerated the loss of faith in institutions is that we've drifted far away from some of our very original institutions that were designed by the founders, enshrined in the Constitution, the idea of federalism, the idea of separation of powers. You know, the founders were very focused on the decentralization of power. We've had a tremendous accumulation of power in Washington, D.C. compared to the states. For the last 100 years, we've had a tremendous increase in the power that is accumulated in the executive branch. And I think that this is one of the things that raises the stakes. George Will likes to say the temperature's high because the stakes are high. People feel the stakes are high, and I feel that when people feel that the stakes are high, it gets back to what I said earlier. The end then justifies the means. The potential difference between certain policy outcomes is so great, and I just wonder if that then the dilution of federalism, the distortion of the separation of powers, whether that hasn't then hastened the willingness of people to believe that the end justifies the means and consider extra-legal or unconstitutional means in order to achieve certain policy ends. I mean, that's something that we've seen each of the last 4 administrations. 50% of them Democratic, 50% of them Republican do.
Jeffrey, thoughts on Peter's exposition of history and some of the relationship that plays to shaping this lack of faith in institutions that we see today?
Peter's absolutely right that many of the founders thought that deliberation at the local level was the best way of achieving self-government. Jefferson thinks that only in self-governing wards can citizens exercise direct democracy and are most likely to govern their own affairs. The difficulty we face now is that we're seeing this sort of mistrust in facts even at the local level because of the politicization of facts themselves. Take January 6th, 2020. The 2020 election was not stolen. All of the federal judges to consider the question rejected the false election claims on a nonpartisan basis. And yet, state officials as well as national officials continue to insist that there was fraud and the election was stolen, even though it wasn't. That's not a problem that can be fixed by federalism. It's the fact that facts have become politicized and people are more interested in achieving their political goals than actually making up their own minds. That's really a problem that can't be easily solved. Law cannot solve it because the Supreme Court has correctly said that false statements are generally protected by the First Amendment. With some exceptions like fraud and defamation, we want to have a broad ground for breathing room, as the court said in New York Times v. Sullivan, so that you can't politicize political opinions. And that's why Jefferson says you have to have faith that truth will combat error in a fair fight without government coercion. You don't want government putting its hand on the scales and telling people what to believe. Jefferson says that always ends in uniformity and oppression. So law is not the answer. What's the solution? It has to be citizens thinking for themselves, not taking their facts from politicized leaders, not who are telling them what to think to express their allegiance to one side or another, but actually reading the primary source documents, going back and evaluating the record. There's extensive hearings, reading the trial transcripts, and making up their own minds. What we come back to is that democracy puts a huge burden on the citizen to educate themselves. Thinking for yourself requires work. It requires digging in and informing yourself and taking the time to read. And that's why, back to civic education, it is urgently important that great institutions like all of ours, Cato and Brookings and the National Constitution Center, put these resources online so citizens can read them for themselves and make up their own minds.
Peter, let me briefly pivot to you on this question, because part of what Jeffrey was just talking about was some of the reason why you thought we needed to launch Project Sphere in the first place. That measure of thinking about polarization, the complicated factors that has on the way in which we engage citizens, share ideas, and work across differences. Can you speak a little bit about why we thought this project made sense in the first place and some of the ways in which conversations like this, that modeling a civil discourse, can help overcome the deeply divided nature that we're seeing?
Yeah, sure. And you know the history quite well, Allan, but I had begun to be asked to speak at some high schools, and that's an invitation I always accept. And it became clear that there was a lot of concern on the part of educators, middle school, high school, that the toxicity of politics, the polarization was seeping into the schools. And they were seeing conflict between, for lack of a better term, red team students and blue team students. And as we talked to more educators, we realized that there was widespread concern. And again, we have to think about what we all have at stake in the rule of law, the Constitution, cooling the temperature of debate, being able to discuss things. And at Cato, we felt that trying to promote these values among middle school and high school students was very much within our mission, because partisan pugilism we're strictly nonpartisan. Partisan pugilism is not something that we enjoy, and it's not particularly advantageous means to persuade people. So if you want to, as we do, we have a philosophy We think that liberty allows people to live their best lives and generates prosperity and allows people to live lives of meaning. That's a pretty nuanced, argument, and you can't make that argument if everyone's yelling at one another. And also, I think anyone, regardless of what your philosophy or ideology is, you'd realize that there's little to be gained from an environment of intense polarization and intense partisanship, and that's why we really launched the program. And the response of our supporters, who have really allowed us to grow the program significantly, and so many partners across the ideological spectrum. This is not the first time that either Elaine or Jeff has participated in a Sphere event, and we're really grateful for their participation and their really the kind of mutual recognition that being able to disagree respectfully, discuss things civilly is very important, and also to recognize where we do have common grounds. The two-party system I always view as kind of an artificial construct. People tend to decide which jersey they're wearing, and then that tells them all they believe on certain policy issues. And I think one of the messages that we have to deliver to young people and to students is, what you believe on a particular in a particular area of policy has got to be based on, your values and principles, analysis, observation, and experience. It shouldn't be based on, what jersey you wear. And also, just recognizing that one of the things that, and maybe it's easier for us to say because we're unaffiliated, but it's always maybe amusing is not the right word, but amusing to me that. In a partisan context, everyone thinks that the politicians on the other side are terrible, but the people on their own team are great. And I think basically letting students have an appreciation for the flaws that exist on both sides is a way to get beyond the current environment and to the things that Jeff was really talking about, learning, reason, understanding, history, very important.
And that's why, going back to civic education and to college education, where I spent some of my years, we really do need to get to a point where teachers and principals and university presidents feel comfortable having both sides of an issue being discussed and people brought to class. I remember teaching at the Kennedy School for many years, and one time I brought in Grover Norquist, who is a friend of mine. He is a staunch conservative and an anti-tax guy. He built a pretty powerful anti-tax movement, and some of my students were appalled. They were appalled that I brought in this conservative. And I said, you're supposed to be learning how to operate in the world of politics and government. How can you learn this if you never ever meet anybody who thinks differently than you do? Absolutely. You should be. That's what we should be doing all the time. We should be exposing people to both sides of the debate, and we should be getting specific in the debate, because that's where the hostility falls apart. It falls apart when you start talking about, okay, what do you really want the government to do, and what should it do at the local level? I'll give you one thing I'd get rid of at the federal level: HUD. Okay? Why do we have a Department of Housing and Urban Development? That is a regional and a local and an urban thing. Why do we have it in the federal government?
Why don't we write an op-ed together?
Right, exactly. On that, we can get rid of HUD in a minute. Yes. And I think if you play out the reasons, a lot of people would understand that. The Department of Education, they've got a student loan program in it. So the question is, do we want a federal student loan program, first of all? And I think there's reasons both pro and con. Do we want a federal student loan program? And if so, do we have a department for it, or should we just put it in the Treasury Department? Okay, once you get to the specifics, this weird hostility about a blob, a swamp, right, or a blob that nobody knows what's in it, it goes away. It goes away.
So I'd like to wrap the conversation by thinking a little bit about the role each of the organizations that you represent play in helping overcome, I'll call it these sort of dual problems. One, that kind of polarization that exists in society, but two, how through our work at the National Constitution Center, the Brookings Institution, and the Cato Institute, we can help think about restoring that measure of faith in institutions in a way that is merited, but also productive. So with that as an enormous question, Jeff, let me start with you. Thinking about the National Constitution Center, how do you all approach this now, and what are some of the ways in which your organization can help things go right?
It is so meaningful to bring together Americans of different perspectives to explore areas of agreement and disagreement about every area of the Constitution. When it comes to constitutional debate, you've got to present all sides because the Constitution is made for people of fundamentally differing points of view, and there are majority opinions and dissents for any constitutional issue. So all of our content is hosted on this amazing interactive Constitution that brings together the leading liberals, conservatives, and libertarians to debate every clause of the Constitution, describing what they agree and disagree about. And it just blows my mind, the richness of this content, just as Amy Coney Barrett and Neil Katyal debating the meaning of the habeas corpus clause, and multiply that by 80 clauses and 160 scholars. It's just extraordinarily illuminating. And then a podcast where every week I get to call up a leading liberal and conservative scholar to debate the constitutional issue of the week. This week it's the transgender case before the Supreme Court. I can't wait to learn about the best arguments on both sides from the scholars, and I can't have an informed opinion until I've taken the time to learn from them and actually read the materials. And that's the We the People podcast, and it's so meaningful. And then, I feel like a Ginsu knife salesman, but you asked what we're doing. We have this wonderful new Constitution 101 class that we just launched with Khan Academy with the help of Jeff and Janine Yass, a friend of Cato and the NCC. And it's a free Constitution course for high school students with the greatest constitutional scholars in America, Robbie George and Heather Gerken, and just all this marvelous diversity of views, all teaching the Constitution for high school kids. It's great for adults too, so I want Cato folks who are watching to check it out. And there are quizzes and primary source documents, and it all goes back to those primary sources so people can read them themselves and make up their own minds. The point is, and we're all experiencing this in different ways, it takes work to bring together people who disagree. This is an age when liberals, conservatives, and libertarians don't ordinarily talk to one another. And by mindfully reaching out to people, by creating thoughtful platforms where they can actually take the time to talk for a half hour or an hour. This isn't just a TikTok problem. You've got to take time. And then by having faith in the commitment of Americans to take the time to learn and grow and to educate themselves, you can just do an amazing amount of work. We live in an extraordinary time when all these documents can be offered free and online, the podcasts, the courses. It's just marvelous time for lifelong learning. All we need to do is inspire our fellow citizens to take the time to learn, and that's exactly what we're going to do.
And I love that point. I want to emphasize one thing that you said there. It's we're in an environment where it's really easy to choose not to engage with people who think differently than we do, whether that's in school, whether it's in our daily lives, whatever it might happen to be. But if we're going to get to a spot where we have that faith in our institutions, where we overcome that measure of polarization, taking the time to choose to engage with people and engage in the kinds of resources that help us do that in an easy way, like what the NCC is doing, is a fantastically important point. Elaine, similar question, thinking about polarization, thinking about Brookings, what's the work that you guys are doing that can help solve for this underlying problem?
Well, one of the things I did when I came to Brookings years ago was started a blog post called FixGov. And we focused it on government problems, right? What's the problem at CMS, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, right? And we looked at the personnel over the years and what their problems were and why it was so difficult to find fraud in the Medicare system, et cetera, et cetera. And then we branched into politics. And we wrote a lot about each election. We did surveys of congressional candidates, et cetera, to try and separate out what was actually happening in the electorate from all the other stuff that was going on, all the propaganda that was going on. As the blog posts grew, and they grew fortunately very, very large, as our readership grew, we began to study who was reading it. And we found that our average age was 35. And that brings us back to where we started, which is civic education. There's a generation or two out there who are now adults, who have to vote, who started to read newspapers and maybe go to work and discuss these things. They don't know anything. They need groups like us. They're going online. They're looking for explanations. To tell you the demand, we did one 4 years ago about illegal immigration and how do people estimate the number of illegal immigrants. After all, they're illegal, they're hiding, they're not saying, hello, I'm here. And we got 1.1 million hits in a week on that simple explainer piece. There's a thirst out there because their education was so lacking. There's a thirst out there for basic information about the public sector, whether it be the Constitution, whether it be liberty and some of the founding fathers, or whether it be just the nuts and bolts of the government that they're in. And that's one of the things we're trying to do. I will tell you, this mission surprised me, okay? But I think it's one of the most important things we do.
Thanks, Elaine. Peter, similar question.
Well, and right back at you. I mean, what you and your team are doing with Sphere has been tremendous, and the content that you've been building. And I really have to say, especially to the teachers who have engaged with us. I mean, thousands and thousands of teachers around the country. It's really been inspiring. And our Sphere community is, I think, the most diverse community that's a part of Cato, particularly philosophically. And that's exactly what we're trying to build. We work very hard to engage with we have common ground with anyone. One of the things that I do tell the Sphere teachers when we have the summit is that I could go out in the street here in DC, pull a person over, and I'm going to agree with them on probably 50% of issues. Which 50% is going to depend upon which for, again, lack of a better term, side they're on. But we really try to take that seriously, the fact that we do have areas of agreement and areas of profound disagreement with nearly everybody. But whether it's the Sphere community, our outreach on Capitol Hill, the Congressional Fellowship Program that we have on Capitol Hill, you find an incredible mix of people from across the spectrum. We have the Congressional Fellowship Program 4 times a year, and it ends up being roughly evenly split between Democrats and Republicans. I think that's fairly unique in Washington. And also, I think what has gone through a thread that goes through a lot of what we've discussed, I think, is being intellectually honest, and again, not letting the end justify the means. And Cato, we have inherited from the folks who have built the Institute over many decades, very strong adherence to principle. And it's something that one of the things we're very proud of is that people across the spectrum will say that, I don't always agree with Cato, or we disagree in this area, but I think that Cato always says what it really thinks and is rooted in the principles that underlie its philosophy. And I think one of the most important things we can do is to continue to live up to that legacy, to be an example of intellectual honesty, again, not trying to agree with everybody and be honest about the areas of disagreement. But I think modeling that kind of organization is a very, very important contribution that we can make.
So thank you all. The purpose of Sphere is to debate and consider ideas in a respectful forum. Thank you to Peter, Elaine, and Jeffrey for joining me here today. For more information about Sphere, please visit projectsphere.org. And thank you so much for watching.